This is Tommy Wasserman, and I will give you the presentation on Archaic Mark Revisited, tying up some loose ends. I gave this paper at the SBL Annual Meeting in San Antonio, virtually in the New Testament Textual Criticism Seminar or program unit. But some people missed it, so I decided to record it here again. The advantage, of course, is that I don't have this time limitation, but I will keep it as short as possible. So let's go. In 1945, E.C. Colwell announced a manuscript in the University of Chicago with a very ancient text. We noted that as we began the study of the manuscript that it was very late in origin, but very early in the nature of its content and its miniatures. On these grounds, we decided to christen it the Archaic Mark. Colwell, however, had little to say concerning its provenance, just a few words in the beginning of this article. In the year 1937, the University of Chicago purchased from an anonymous kinsman of an anonymous dealer a small manuscript of the Gospel of Mark in Greek. In the next year, 1946, Harold Willoughby provided some more information in an article on archaic crucifixion iconography. The manuscript, it turned out, had been brought to his and his colleague Edgar J. Goodspeed's attention already in 1931 by Sir Peter Nersessian, who sent them some line drawings of the 17 illuminations in the manuscript, made by her former fellow student Andreas Xyngopoulos, who by now was Ephor for Byzantine antiquities in the Greek government. And you can see the two students in the image below. They are sitting around or standing around Gabriel Millet, a legend in iconography. And these images are from Willoughby's publication in 1932, when he actually published one of Xyngopoulos' line drawings, as you can see here on the plate, as a comparanda to the Rockefeller McCormick New Testament, and an image of the raising of Jairus' daughter. And there are some similarities and differences. After the transfer of the manuscript to Chicago in 1937, Xyngopoulos was asked directly for more information about the provenance. And he replied in a letter in 1939, which is cited in a footnote by Willoughby, and I've translated it from French. I know very little about the provenance of this manuscript. It once belonged to an antique dealer, in whose hands I saw it, since this antique dealer, already dead, was from Cappadocia and had a lot of connections with Asia Minor. One could suppose that this manuscript would come from Anatolia. We now know that the dealer died in 1917, so he's saying that he saw the manuscript and presumably he made the line drawings before or in 1917. And in fact, he was 26 years old by that time, and he had, I checked it, he had already published 7 articles starting from 1913, so this is quite possible. So Willoughby noted both parallels and differences between the iconographic cycles of 2427, Archaic Mark, and of 777, that is Athens National Library, Greek 93, a tetra evangelion dated to the end of the 12th century. And he flirted with the idea that they may have shared an exemplar. The script in which Codex 2427 is penned is the despair of the trained palaeographer, he said. This is not at all the usual Byzantine bookhand. It is crude, irregular, choppy, uneven, difficult to read, as you may see in this sample here on this slide. And in a letter, Colwell said, certainly the most baffling manuscript from the viewpoint of palaeography and text that I've ever seen. Colwell counted only 188 variants from Vaticanus, and further stated that of 73 readings, otherwise singular, to Codex Vaticanus, Archaic Mark shares 46. And among the differences, he noted that Archaic Mark included the long ending of Mark, as you can see here in the slide. And this is the short ending in Vaticanus, but an empty column. In a 1947 review of the Festschrift, in which Willoughby's article was published, Robert Casey concluded that the manuscript was in every way extraordinary, and the curious anomalies of its script and text form a pattern strikingly similar to that of its miniatures. The parchment is indubitably old. The text agrees not only with B, but with the modern misreadings of B, and there are modern Greek words here and there. It is to be hoped that in the forthcoming edition, there was no edition, by the way, a chapter may be written by an advocatus diaboli who would do his best to prove that the codex was a manufacture of the 19th century, executed by workmen with the skill and limitations of a Simonides, familiar with Lachmann's edition and the modern Greek Bible, and thinking in Greek. We jump now to a 1988 progress report on the first ever chemical analysis of particles taken from Byzantine illuminated manuscripts in the University of Chicago Library. 10 manuscripts were sampled in this study. And two of the authors you have here on the slide were Robert Nelson, who is an art historian, and Mary Virginia Orna, who is the chemist. So Orna and her team had applied Fourier transform infrared microspectroscopy, I don't know about the pronunciation, to a sample from an illumination in 2427, Archaic Mark. Apparently, it contained a chemical from a pigment Prussian blue that was not invented until 1704. And the lack of authenticity observed for the illuminations did not necessarily mean that the text was late, since the illuminations could have been retouched or improved, that is, or added later. Art historian Robert Nelson noted that the iconographical parallels to Athens, that there were parallels to Athens 93, but he added, there exists also a set of fragmentary gospels in the Hermitage Museum in Leningrad that must have been made by the same scribe and illuminator, because the similarities in script, initials, and painting style can hardly be fortuitous. Neither of these manuscripts has a genealogy that can be traced prior to about 1930, a fact suggesting that their origin may very well be during the flurry of Athenian forgeries that came to the market in the 1920s. Here I put three images from the three manuscripts, so you can see what is presumably the model in Athens 93 and two versions of it. And actually, I think, although I didn't have access to anything better than these black and white images from the New Testament virtual manuscript room, that the images are better in the St Petersburg manuscript on the whole, or of course best in the model from an artistic point of view. In an article in 2006, Margaret Mitchell and Patricia Duncan reintroduced the enigmas of Chicago's Archaic Mark, announcing the online publication of digital images and offering a fresh collation of its readings in order to facilitate an accurate accounting of the manuscript in further editions and text critical studies. But Mitchell and Duncan started, as one should, with the known history of the manuscript, its provenance. And what do we learn? In 1917, the manuscript, quote, was found among the possessions of Mr. John Askitopoulos, an Athenian collector and dealer of antiquities, after his death in that year. Askitopoulos' nephew, George Vlastos, later to become a prominent scholar of philosophy, had studied in Chicago under Edgar Goodspeed in the late 1920s, and now wrote a letter on behalf of his relatives in Athens, asking if the University of Chicago would like to purchase this manuscript. The details, quote, of the sale remain murky, apparently because Goodspeed and Willoughby deliberately wished to keep them from the public eye, presumably to protect the seller and others from tariffs or other penalties from the Greek government. On the issue of dating, they said that estimates of date ranged from the 13th to the 19th or even the 20th century. Quote, the earlier dating lays claim to the palaeographic judgment of such esteemed scholars as Cursop Lake and Hermann Freiherr von Soden, whereas the later dating is reflective of a suspicion that the Codex's readings, closer to Codex Vaticanus than any extant beta manuscript, are just too good to be true, and must therefore depend upon a modern text critical edition of the Greek New Testament. At the very least, such a suspicion still awaits the testing of the Codex's reading against the various available collations and critical texts of the New Testament published in the late 18th and 19th centuries to see if dependence can be established. Someone heard that challenge. But as of yet, the proposition that Archaic Mark used 777, Athens 93, as its iconographic model has not been proven in any detail. Even if direct influence can be proven, that does not in itself settle the question of who might have used the Athens Codex as an exemplar, and most pressingly, when and why. Mitchell and Duncan had not been able to acquire images of the Codex from the Hermitage Museum, and it's very difficult, I can assure you. I have tried. On the other hand, they could access one published plate with a text of Mark 16, 1-9, and they found both similarities and differences in terms of palaeography, but considerable differences in terms of text. And here you have the two manuscripts side by side, so we can see they give the impression of a very similar graphic outlook, and even these initials are very similar. Obviously, much more work needs to be done, they claimed, and multiple hypotheses about the date of the images, both original and possible restoration, and the inscription of the text need to be carefully sifted and tested. The integration of scholarly expertise in a wide range of fields, palaeography, textual criticism, iconography, codicology, history, chemistry, will be essential to this effort. End of quote. Subsequently, the University of Chicago Library formed a task force for further research, Team Archaic Mark, led by Mitchell. In the meantime, Stephen Carlson announced on his blog that he had sent in a proposal to the SBL Annual Meeting in 2006, disclosing the 19th century exemplar of Archaic Mark. And I quote from the conclusion of the abstract, even more significantly, 2427 contains scribal errors occasioned by the unique page layout of the 1860 Buttmann edition. This evidence shows that the exemplar of manuscript 2427 is the 1860 Buttmann edition of the New Testament, or its stereotypic reprints. So before that, some of the readings of Archaic Mark had been included in Nestle Aland 27. The Alands had considered it a category 1 manuscript of the highest text critical value. But now in Nestle Aland 28, there was an exorcism, so that 2427 was excised from the apparatus. And Stephen Carlson even got his own footnote in the edition, since he had proved that this manuscript was a copy of the Gospel of Mark. Yes. And here is a slide showing you just how it looks today on the online Kurzgefasste Liste, the registry of manuscript, where you can see 2427 is marked in red, which means that it has been removed from the list. There is still a date here, with a question mark, which I think could be improved. So it says the 19th century, but we'll come to that. And the task force, the Archaic Mark task force, published their results in 2010 in this article in Novum Testamentum. And they concluded, on the basis of further testing carried out by foremost experts in chemical and codicological analysis, we have secured a fully documented, indisputable result. Manuscript 2427 is a modern production that was made sometime between 1874 and the first decade of the 20th century. So why this date, 1874? It's because they had found this white pigment, lithopone, which was not available until 1874. They had found it in the analysis of the color, white color, and there were many other very interesting aspects and results. I don't have time to go through it, but this article shows for me that the manuscript, Archaic Mark, is valuable not for the critical study of the New Testament, but for studying the techniques of modern forgers. For that purpose, this interdisciplinary project has set a model for the future. So it's an awesome article. But there are still some loose ends to tie up. One such loose end is the dealer John Askitopoulos, who died in 1917 in Athens. Can we know more about this dealer? Yes, we can. I was able to track down an obituary published in 1918 in his Athens publication. And I have translated a little some snippets for you here. It was written by A. Fontes. And in my translation, it reads, after a few days of sickness, he went to be with the Lord, John Askitopoulos, born in Constantinople. He left from there to the capital of free Hellenism, that is Athens. He practiced the finest work of the art dealer, and artifacts of ancient and modern art were coming to the Greek capital from all over the world, from the east and from the west. Wonderful objects of fine arts and crafts, causing daily visits at the store by members of the royal family, by ambassadors and diplomats of the highest class and of the most sophisticated background in general. I also have translated a sentence here to show that he had family. He appeared as a father and head of the family in the spiritual education of the children, who obviously had the manuscript in their possession after his death. So it can be established that Askitopoulos really had an antique shop, which was rather on the high profile and well known in Athens. Also, I've been able to find out that the particular items in Askitopoulos' shop in Athens were known by this guy, Demetrios Pelekasis, who was a famous artist from Zakynthos, but also an infamous forger of icons and manuscripts, we know. And here in one of his articles in a journal, Pinakotheke, published in 1916, it was an article on the Moskos family of artists. He says towards the end of the article, Johannes Askitopoulos also holds a work by Johannes Mosko in his gallery in Athens, which is worth mentioning. One wonders if that is maybe a forged work or not, but we don't know. But interestingly, Demetrios Pelekasis signs off this article, also saying that he's an artist, sographos, and imitator, mimetes ton palaion ikonon, an imitator of the old icons. What is an imitator? Well, in the same article, he says, my friend Marinos Sigouros owns several watercolor drafts, that is of Mosko's paintings, which in 1908 I converted into pure mural paintings of this genuine art, selling it to various foreign museums rather than to archaeological shops in Athens. So that proves that he sold his works, and sometimes maybe to shops in Athens and sometimes to foreign museums. They captured all my mimetic art, applied mysteriously with all the antiquity of time. Many of these sold items were considered genuine by art experts, especially the one of the Archangel Michael was considered in America a piece of heirloom art, according to the judgment of Mr. Georg Damalost, professor of Greek and Roman antiquities. So what we see here is actually Pelekas is kind of bragging that he could really imitate the Byzantine heritage, and it was considered genuine by foreign experts. And I don't think he would tell them that the items he sold were actually not genuine. So in a couple of years ago, Gary Vikan wrote an interesting article on some of Pelekas' forged Byzantine miniatures. And Vikan says that the Pelekas' oeuvre includes nearly 24 manuscripts and single leaves, as well as a substantial group of forged icons. Here is just to show you 2 examples that were sent to me by Vikan. These images, and they are items from the Benaki Museum. So it's a manuscript with an evangelist portrait here, and it's an icon to show you that he was really skilled. Here is a detail from this icon and a detail from Archaic Mark, just to show you that, yeah, it could have been made in his workshop, but it's just a suggestive detail. So here comes an anecdote from Manolis Chatzidakis, who was a famous Greek Byzantinist and museum curator and art historian. And he has a chapter in this catalog of icons from the Velimesis collection. And he shares an anecdote about Pelekas. Demetrios Pelekas is a Zacynthian painter and conservator of icons, son of the painter Spiros Pelekas, who knew the recipes of early painters. He had no qualms about adding signatures as well, often to order, so deceiving many of the earlier collectors and scholars. Characteristic is a chance meeting I had with Pelekas in the Dionysius Lovredos Museum, on which he had collaborated officially. So let me stop there and say just that Lovredos had a magnificent collection of icons, but in some of the iconostasis, with room for various icons, there were missing icons. So he had actually commissioned Pelekas to fill in these gaps and to provide missing icons. So Chatzidakis asked him, "Tell me, Mimis, now that we're alone, which icons you added a signature to save us the trouble of finding out?" Clearly insulted, he puffed out his chest and answered disarmingly, "I'm an artist and I do my job. You're an archaeologist, find them." And I've seen that Chatzidakis was the one who helped Gary Vikan to identify Pelekas and his workshop as the forger of the manuscript he discussed in his article. Another loose end. What about the sister manuscript, Hermitage Omega 1162? That is Gregorialan 2537 in St Petersburg. Can we know more about this manuscript? Well, the first report I have found is by Marcel Richard in 1962. We hesitate, and I translate from French, we hesitate between the hypothesis of a forgery, very awkward, and that of a provincial artist of the 13th, 14th, or 15th century who would have liked to imitate the professional miniaturists without knowing the technique of these. Then there were other catalogs by Coit and Evgenia Grandstream, but there were no suspicions of forgery here. So I jumped to an exhibition catalog from 2000 with a description of this manuscript by Yuri Pianitsky, who still works at the Hermitage Museum. And he says that, in our opinion, the manuscript should not be considered as a forgery. This view is supported by the recently revealed history of how it came to Russia. The antiquarian Mikhail Savostin, who purchased the manuscript in Istanbul in 1914, had an irreproachable reputation and possessed a rare professionalism. And he continues to say that Savostin got the manuscript evaluated by experts and so on. So here he says that the manuscript was bought in 1914 in Istanbul, but later on, in a more recent article from 2013, it's a chapter in this book, Studie de Museologie. He has an article on the history of the antique market in Russia before and after the October Revolution, Mikhailovich Savostin. And from this article, we gather that Savostin bought the manuscript during a trip to the Mediterranean area in the spring of 1914. From the memoirs, it had seemed to be in Istanbul, but Pianitsky now thinks it was possibly bought from John Askitopoulos in Athens because of the connections to Archaic Mark, and there are no records of the actual purchase. And now Pianitsky says it is likely a forgery, but a final verdict has not yet been rendered. A comprehensive analysis like that of the Archaic Mark is necessary. And perhaps he's working on this. Actually, he told me that I cannot get images of the manuscript until they have been published by the museum, and that he is working on an article, so we will see. It was supposed to appear in 2020 in this year, but I have not seen it. So, and I've emailed him and he has not replied yet, so we will see about that. Another interesting thing is the proportion of the size of the two manuscripts. You have the St. Petersburg on the left and you have Archaic Mark on the right, and you can see that they have a proportion, which means that exactly 15 sheets of parchment are required to produce both of the manuscript. So St. Petersburg is only 8 folios, so it's incomplete, and it has parts of Luke's Gospel, the end, and Mark's, the beginning of Mark's Gospel. Oh, sorry, it has the ending of the final part of Mark's Gospel and the beginning of Luke. That's right. Sorry about that. Third loose end. It's the iconographic model Athens 93. What more can we say about this? How did the forgers access that model? Because you have 4 images from Athens to the left here, which are common to the 3 manuscripts. And then you have another 5 actually in common for just Athens and Archaic Mark. And then you have further images in Archaic Mark and St. Petersburg, which are unique to them. So in Vikan's article, we see that Pelecasis clearly had access to a number of modern scholarly volumes. And he says exact models may be found from most of the figurative decoration produced within the Pelecasis workshop. And for example, he singles out Cosimo Stornaiolo, Miniature delle Omilie di Giacomo Monaco e delle Evangeliario Greco Urbinate. That's a manuscript in the Vatican. That precisely this volume was exploited as a model book by the Pelecasis workshop is certain. So he goes on to prove that. And this was published in 1910. So I thought I must check that one. And actually, one image possibly can explain the one unique illumination in the St. Petersburg, because all of the others have their model in Athens 93, except for this one. So perhaps they got it from this publication in 1910, which suits also the date. Perhaps also the special posture, because so many details are similar in the evangelist portrait from Athens 93, but that is Luke. But in Archaic Mark, this is Mark. But all other details are very similar. But the posture of the evangelist with the hand towards his chin, that may come from an image in this publication from 1910. It's suggestive anyway. I also checked various publications, and actually the best candidate was this standard work by Gabriel Millet, Recherches sur l'iconographie de l'Évangile. Sorry for my French. It was published in 1916, but it includes only 2 images that are contained in Archaic Mark and also in St. Petersburg, at least this one. So I had a good idea. I wrote to the library, the Athens National Library, and I asked them who have had access to the manuscript. Do you still have an old ledger? And it would be interesting to know who has accessed the manuscript. And from Stephen Carlson, we know that they also had multiple editions of Buttmann's Greek New Testament there in that library. So I was told actually that there were 3 persons who had accessed the manuscript before 1914, or actually before 1916, according to their registration book. And one name stood out. I have checked the other persons, and Maria de Latte is actually a bit too late if the manuscript, St. Petersburg manuscript, was bought in the spring 1914. And Lamprakis was a Greek professor of language, but Stephanos Xenopoulos was an artist from Zakynthos who accessed the manuscript several times. Here in January 1912, along with another bunch of mostly illuminated manuscripts, and then another time in 23rd of October in 1913, and then in 1914 only this manuscript, that was in June. Stephanos Xenopoulos was an art history teacher and artist from Zakynthos, and it turned out that he was a good friend of Demetrios Pelekasis and his father, because he was slightly older. And he actually worked together with Pelekasis to restore the Hagios Dionysios church on Zakynthos, which you see here on the slide below. And here is another example of his beautiful mosaics in the municipal healing spring of Loutraki. Which, and he was also, by the way, a cartoonist, I've learned, or cartoonist. So I was able to find also his obituary. And this is the last image of Stephanos Xenopoulos, because he died in 1950. And lo and behold, it was Demetrios Pelekasis who had written the obituary. And I will just cite the final part of it. He, that is Xenopoulos, commanded as few the history of art. He knew all the aesthetic currents and the schools. He creatively continued the Byzantine tradition, which he experienced as a genuine Greek, and adapted it to the artistic needs of our time as a pure Ionian. So here is a slide showing you the Novum Testamentum Graecum Editio Critica Major, which just came out very recently, the ECM of Mark, which actually includes 2537 still. So the sister manuscript in St. Petersburg is included in the ECM. And it seems as if, when I check the text and the comparison, that it has been copied from a genuine Byzantine manuscript. So it's an interesting question whether this manuscript, which is a fake in a way, produced in the early 20th century, presumably, but copied from a genuine manuscript, if it should be removed. And Holger Struthos said during our session and my presentation that yes, it should probably be removed. In any case, the date is here 12th or 13th century, and I think it should be changed to the 19th or 20th century, more specifically these dates here, which I proposed. So when, I think it was produced in 1912 or 1913, during this period, when in connection with Xenopoulos' first 2 visits in the library where he saw the model, and Archaic Mark maybe in the later half of 1914, after Xenopoulos' last visit to the library, where he's very occupied with Athens 93 in 1914 in the summer, where presumably Savostin had already bought the first St Petersburg manuscript with fewer illuminations also. So there are 17 in Archaic Mark, so quite a few, and more from Athens 93, but at least one other model. 2 illuminated manuscripts were manufactured in Athens by an artist in Pelekas' circle, presumably Xenopoulos, commissioned by the dealer John Askitopoulos, possibly, made after drawings of Athens National Library 93 and at least one other model. One manuscript was copied from a genuine Byzantine exemplar, and the other was copied from Buttmann's 1860 edition. One manuscript was sold by Askitopoulos to Savostin, presumably. The other was sold to the University of Chicago by Askitopoulos' children. Why? Well, for financial gain, for the fun of it, and for doing what the mimetis does, creatively continue the Byzantine tradition and adapt it to our time. And that's all. Let's see now here if I can stop the recording. So thank you very much. You can send me questions, if you will, via email or respond in other ways. I will upload this presentation to a space on YouTube, the IGNTP space, I think, for presentations. Thank you very much.